She didn't scream when they tied her hands. She didn't beg when they dragged her into the middle of that corral and forced her down onto her knees in the dirt, while 60 men stood around her in silence and watched. She just looked up at the sky, that wide, burning Wyoming sky, and made herself a promise. If I survive this morning, I will make sure every single one of these men remembers what they chose to do and what they chose to ignore. Then she smelled the iron heating in the fire. Before this story goes any further, if you've ever felt like the world decided who you were before you had a chance to prove them wrong, this one is for you. Please subscribe to this channel and follow Clara's story all the way to the end. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Wyoming, 1884. And let's find out what one woman and one outlaw did that nobody in that territory ever forgot. The iron was already in the fire when Clara Whitmore opened her eyes that morning. She hadn't slept. She had lain on the hard floor of the storage room where Nathaniel Crow's men had locked her the night before, staring at the ceiling, while the sound of boots moved back and forth outside the door, listening to the low voices of men who had already decided what her morning would look like before she had any say in it whatsoever. She was 26 years old. She had been working on Crow Ranch for 5 years, and in 5 years she had never once been late, never once failed to complete what was asked of her, never once raised her voice or caused trouble or given Nathaniel Crow a single reason to look at her with the particular kind of cold contempt he reserved for people he considered beneath him, which Clara had come to understand was everyone who could not match his wealth or his influence in the territory. She had cooked for his 30 ranch hands every morning and every evening. She had mended clothing and repaired saddles and kept the account book so clean and so accurate that Crow himself had once told a visiting businessman that Clara Whitmore was the most organized employee he had ever hired in 40 years of operation. He said it like it was a compliment. Clara had understood even then that it was a trap. She pressed her back against the wall of the storage room and breathed slowly, the way her mother had taught her when she was a child, and the world felt like it was pressing in from every direction. Breathe first, her mother used to say. Then think. Then act. In that order and no other. Clara breathed. Then, she thought about the account book she had found hidden behind the false panel in Crow's office 3 weeks ago. She had not been looking for it. She had been searching for a misplaced supply invoice, the kind of administrative error that drove Crow into a cold fury if it went unaddressed, when her fingers found the edge of the panel and pressed, and the wood swung inward, and she saw the second ledger sitting alone on a small shelf in the dark, like something that knew it was guilty. She almost put it back. Almost. But something made her open it. Maybe it was 5 years of watching numbers that never quite added up the way they should. Maybe it was the quiet, persistent feeling she'd carried since her first month on the ranch, that the debt she had inherited from her father's estate, the debt Crow claimed gave him legal authority over her labor until it was repaid, was not shrinking the way it ought to be given how hard she worked and how carefully she tracked every transaction. She opened the ledger, and the world she thought she understood shifted completely beneath her feet. The names went back 11 years. Women mostly. Some men. All of them poor. All of them desperate. All of them arriving at Crow Ranch under the weight of a debt that had been carefully, deliberately constructed to ensure it could never be fully repaid. Every payment was recorded. Every deduction was recorded alongside it for housing, for food, for the use of tools, for the cost of uniforms, for administrative fees that Clara had never heard mentioned in any conversation, had never seen referenced in any legitimate account book fees that existed only in this hidden ledger and existed for one purpose: to make certain the debt always grew faster than the work could reduce it. Clara had stood in that hidden space behind the wall for a long time. Then she carefully memorized every page she could before she replaced the ledger exactly as she found it, and closed the panel, and walked back to the main house and finished her work for the day, with her hands perfectly steady and her face perfectly composed. She spent the next 3 weeks being careful. Too careful, apparently, because Nathaniel Crow had noticed. He didn't confront her directly. That wasn't his method. He simply stopped speaking to her in the measured, businesslike way he normally addressed employees, and began watching her the way a man watches something he's already decided to deal with, but hasn't yet determined the best approach. She had started documenting everything she could remember from the hidden ledger, writing it down in a small notebook she kept sewn into the lining of her jacket. She had started asking quiet questions of the other workers, carefully, casually, never in a way that could be reported back. And she had started planning. She had not planned fast enough. 3 nights ago, one of the senior ranch hands, a man named Gerald Pruitt, who had worked for Crow for 12 years and whose loyalty to the ranch owner was absolute and long since purchased, had knocked on the door of her bunkhouse room and told her in a voice completely empty of apology that Mr. Crow wanted to see her in his office immediately. She had walked into that office knowing something was wrong. Crow had been sitting behind his desk with his hands folded in front of him, and his expression set into the particular configuration of cold authority that Clara had learned to read as a warning. "Sit down, Miss Whitmore." She sat. "I'm going to ask you something once," he said, "and I want you to consider your answer carefully before you give it to me." "All right." "Have you been in my private office without permission?" Clara looked at him steadily. "I've been in your office many times, Mr. Crow. It's where we conduct business." "That is not what I asked you." The silence between them stretched. "Then I suppose I don't know which visit you're referring to," Clara said. Something moved behind his eyes. Not anger exactly, more like the quiet satisfaction of a man who has just confirmed what he already believed. "You've been a good worker," he said. "I want you to know I recognize that. 5 years is a long time, and I won't pretend I haven't noticed your value." "Thank you. But value and loyalty are 2 different things." He leaned back in his chair. "And I find myself questioning your loyalty, Miss Whitmore. I've given you no reason to. That's a matter of perspective." He opened the desk drawer and placed her small notebook on the surface between them. Clara's stomach dropped, the notebook she had sewn into her jacket lining. She didn't know when they had searched her room. She didn't know when they had searched her person. It didn't matter now. "This is a very thorough record," Crow said, tapping the cover with one finger. "You have an extraordinary memory. I've always admired that about you." He paused. "It's also a very serious problem. Those are my private notes, written about my private records." His voice didn't rise. It never rose. That was the thing about Nathaniel Crow that had always frightened her more than anger would have the absolute stillness of him when he was at his most dangerous. "You found my ledger." There was no point in denying it. "I did," she said. "And you understand what that means." "I understand what those records mean," Clara said. "I understand that every woman whose name is in that book was trapped the same way I was trapped. I understand that none of the debts in that ledger were ever meant to be paid off. I understand that what you've been doing for 11 years is not a business practice. It's—" "Careful," he said softly. She met his gaze. "It is slavery," she said. "Hidden behind paperwork and legal language, but slavery." The silence that followed was the longest of her life. Then Crow stood up and straightened his jacket. "The men will come for you in the morning," he said. "Get some sleep." They put her in the storage room that night with her hands bound in front of her and a man posted at the door. And now it was morning, and the iron was already in the fire. Clara heard the bolt slide back. Gerald Pruitt filled the doorway, his hat pushed back on his head, his expression carrying that particular brand of discomfort that belonged to men who knew something was wrong and had decided a long time ago that their comfort was worth more than their conscience. "Time to go," he said. Clara stood up. Her knees ached from the floor, and her shoulders were stiff from the position she'd been forced to sleep in, but she stood straight, and she didn't reach for the wall to steady herself. "Where are we going?" she asked, as if she didn't already know. "Outside." "I'd like to know specifically." Pruitt's jaw tightened. "Mr. Crow wants the branding done in the corral, in front of the men." "The branding?" Clara repeated, and her voice was very even, and she was proud of how even it was, because she could feel her heart doing something terrible inside her chest. "You understand what that means," Pruitt said. "Marked property of Crow Ranch. Every town in the territory recognizes the brand. Nobody'll hire you. Nobody'll take you in." He paused. "It's not—" He stopped. "It's not what?" she said. "It's not my call," he said, and he looked away. She walked past him into the morning light. 60 men stood in and around the corral. Some of them she recognized ranch hands she had cooked for and nodded to in passing. For 5 years, men who had eaten at her tables and worn the clothing she mended and lived in spaces she kept clean. Some of them were strangers, brought in specifically for this morning, and she understood that Crow wanted witnesses, not because he was confident, but because he understood the power of complicity, the way a crowd of observers became a crowd of participants, without ever having to lift a hand themselves. She recognized the blacksmith, a man named Aldous from the nearest town, who was crouched beside the fire and not looking at her. She recognized the iron, Crow's brand, a simple C with a ridge through it. Simple, permanent, designed to mark something as belonging to him. She was put to her knees in the center of the corral. The dirt was cold this early. She could feel it through her clothing. She looked at the faces around her and didn't find mercy in any of them. But she found something else. She found discomfort. She found men who were watching the ground, or watching the sky, or watching anywhere except directly at her. And she cataloged that carefully, because discomfort was not nothing. Discomfort was a crack in the wall of complicity, and cracks could be widened if you knew how. Nathaniel Crow walked to the center of the corral. He was dressed well. He always dressed well. He believed strongly in the authority of appearance. He stopped in front of her and looked down. "This is what happens," he said loudly enough for the assembled men to hear, "when someone in my employ decides that their curiosity is more important than their obligations." Clara looked up at him. "Tell me something," she said, and her voice carried clearly in the morning air. "Of all these men standing around us right now, how many of them know their own accounts are fraudulent?" A ripple moved through the crowd. Crow's expression didn't change. "You're wasting time." "Am I?" She looked at the men around her, turning her head slowly, deliberately, meeting eyes where she could find them. "Every man here who has ever had a debt held over him by this ranch should be listening very carefully, because what you're watching happen to me today can happen to any of you tomorrow. The ledger doesn't have just women's names in it." "Enough," Crow said. "Crow, I found the records," she said, raising her voice. "I found the second account book, the one that shows the real numbers, the real fees, the charges that don't exist anywhere in the official books. I memorized what I could, and the information I recorded is not on this property anymore." This was a gamble. The notebook was gone. She had no other copy. The information she claimed to have placed elsewhere existed only in her memory and in Crow's fear of what she might have managed to pass along before they caught her. But she watched Crow's jaw tighten fractionally, and she knew the gamble had landed. He turned to Aldous. "Now." The blacksmith stood. He lifted the iron. Clara held herself very still. She would not close her eyes. She had decided that. Whatever happened in the next few seconds, she would keep her eyes open, and she would keep looking at Nathaniel Crow, and he would spend the rest of his life, however long or short it proved to be, knowing that she had looked at him without flinching. The iron came closer, and then, from the far edge of the ranch came the sound of a single horse. It wasn't dramatic. That was the thing she would remember afterward. It didn't thunder in or arrive at a gallop with dust rising in great clouds behind it. It was just one horse moving at a steady walk, and it stopped at the edge of the corral fence, and the man on its back sat quietly for a moment and looked at what was happening in front of him. Then he dismounted. He was tall and lean, the kind of lean that came from years of hard travel rather than scarcity, and he moved with the particular unhurried deliberateness of a man who had learned long ago that speed was rarely the point. He wore a dark coat, trail-worn and practical, and a hat pulled low, and he had the look of someone who had seen enough of the world to have very few remaining illusions about it. He walked to the fence and rested one hand on the top rail. He looked at the iron in the blacksmith's hand. He looked at Clara. He looked at Nathaniel Crow. "That iron goes back in the fire," he said. His voice wasn't loud. He didn't need to be loud. There was a quality to it that cut through the morning air and reached every corner of that corral. Without effort, the voice of a man who had said important things in difficult places before and knew exactly how much volume was required. Nathaniel Crow turned slowly to look at him. "Who are you?" Crow said. "Cole Maddox," the man said. Clara saw something move through the crowd at that name. Not fear exactly, recognition. The kind of recognition that comes with a complicated history attached to it. "I know that name," Crow said. "Most people do." "You're an outlaw." "I've been called that," Cole Maddox said evenly. "I've also been called a bounty hunter, a lawman's associate, a troublemaker, and on one memorable occasion, an act of God. The label depends considerably on which side of the conversation you find yourself on." He nodded toward Clara. "Cut her hands free." "You have no authority here," Crow said. "That may be." Cole's eyes moved around the corral, taking a slow, thorough account of every man standing there. "But I count 63 men who are about to become witnesses to a crime. That's a different kind of authority." He looked back at Crow. "I don't need a badge for what I'm here to do." "What exactly are you here to do?" "Stop this." Crow laughed, a short, controlled sound that was designed to communicate dismissal, but carried an undertone of something less confident than his expression suggested. "With one gun against 60 men." Cole Maddox tilted his head slightly. "Not against 60 men," he said. "Against you." He let the distinction sit in the air for a moment. "Because a crowd is only as powerful as the number of people in it who are fully committed to what they're doing." He looked at the assembled men again, slower this time, and Clara watched men look away. "And I'd estimate the genuine commitment in this particular crowd at somewhere around 4, maybe 5. He paused. "Mr. Crow, you're one of the 4. The rest of these men are just hoping they don't have to make a choice today." The silence stretched. Crow looked at his men. Several of them were looking at the ground. "You want to make a legal case," Crow said carefully. "You claim she has records. You want a hearing." "I want that iron back in the fire," Cole said. "Everything else can be discussed like civilized men. But the iron goes back in the fire first. Right now. While I'm watching." Another long moment. Aldous the blacksmith looked at Crow. Crow's jaw worked. Then he gave a single short nod. The iron went back into the fire. Clara felt the air leave her lungs slowly, a release she hadn't let herself take until she was certain. Her hands were still bound, and her knees were still in the dirt, and nothing was resolved. Nothing was even close to resolved. But the iron was back in the fire, and the man at the fence had made that happen, and for one single moment, she allowed herself to feel something she had not permitted herself in 3 days. Hope. Then Crow looked down at her. "This isn't finished," he said quietly. "No," Clara agreed. "It isn't." She looked past him at Cole Maddox, who was still standing at the fence with one hand resting on the rail watching. He gave her a small, single nod. Not reassurance exactly. More like acknowledgement. "I see you. I know what you are. I know what they tried to do." Clara straightened her back. Her knees ached and her shoulders were stiff, and she was still bound and still surrounded by 60 men, and the most dangerous man on the property was still standing 10 feet away from her. But she straightened her back. "Cut her hands free," Cole said again from the fence, and this time after a pause that lasted exactly long enough for Crow to feel the weight of every set of eyes in that corral. Gerald Pruitt crossed to Clara and cut the rope. She stood up. She did not rub her wrists where they hurt. She stood up straight, and she looked at Nathaniel Crow, and she said quietly enough that only he could hear, "You should have paid me what you owed me, and let me walk away 3 years ago." He looked at her for a long moment. "You have no idea what you've started," he said. I have every idea, Clara said. I've been thinking about nothing else for 3 weeks. She walked toward the fence. Cole Maddox held the gate open. She walked through it. Behind her, she could hear Crow speaking to his men in a low, controlled voice, and she could hear the restless sounds of 60 men who had expected this morning to go differently than it had, and she could hear the fire still crackling in the center of the corral. She didn't look back. Cole fell into step beside her, matching her pace without crowding her, keeping a few feet of distance in a way that felt deliberate and respectful. "Cole Maddox," she said without looking at him. "That's right. You have a reputation." "I do. Most of it concerning." "A fair amount of it," he agreed. "Though the concerning parts tend to get told more often than the other kind." "Why did you stop?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Because I was riding past, and I saw what was about to happen," he said. "That's not a reason," Clara said. "Plenty of men ride past things. You came through that gate. Why?" He glanced at her sideways. "You always ask this many questions after someone pulls a gun on 60 men for you." "I ask questions when I don't have enough information," Clara said. "It's a habit. What's your reason?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "I had a sister." Clara looked at him. "She worked for a man like Crow," he said. 8 years ago. Contract labor, false debt, same system, different ranch, different territory." He paused. "I didn't get there in time." "I'm sorry," Clara said. "So am I." He looked ahead. "I don't make it a practice to interfere in other people's business. I've interfered in enough of my own business to last several lifetimes. But there are things I can't ride past. That particular thing is one of them." They had reached his horse. He stopped and untied the reins. "I don't have anywhere to go," Clara said. It wasn't a complaint. It was a statement of fact delivered with the same directness she brought to everything. "They have my belongings. Everything I own is back in that bunkhouse. And they have the notebook." "What notebook?" "I found his hidden ledger 3 weeks ago. The one with the real accounts, every fraudulent debt, every woman he trapped going back 11 years. I wrote down everything I could remember. He found the notebook before I could get it out." Cole looked at her steadily. "But you still remember what was in it?" "I have a very good memory," Clara said. "It's one of the reasons he hired me. He thought it would be useful to him." She met Cole's eyes. "It is going to be useful, just not to him." Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but the closest approximation of one she'd seen from him so far. "How much do you remember?" he said. "Enough to put him away," Clara said. "If I can get in front of the right people. If I can find someone who'll take a woman's testimony seriously, without demanding documentation that's currently locked in a hidden panel behind a wall in his private office. That's a considerable number of conditions." "I know." She looked back toward the ranch, one look measuring, calculating the same look she gave to account books when the numbers seemed wrong, and she needed to understand exactly how wrong they were before she decided what to do about it. "There's a judge in Cheyenne, a federal circuit judge named Harlan Booth. I read an account of his last circuit in a newspaper that came through the ranch 6 months ago. He took on a labor fraud case in Montana and won it without physical documentation on the strength of witness testimony alone." She looked back at Cole. "Do you know him?" "I know of him," Cole said slowly. "Is he honest?" "As honest as federal judges get in this territory, which is a qualified statement, but not a negligible one." "Can you get me to Cheyenne?" He looked at her for a moment. "You want to go directly from being tied up in a corral at dawn to filing a federal testimony in Cheyenne?" "I want to do it before Nathaniel Crow moves that ledger or destroys it," Clara said. "Every hour we wait is an hour he uses to make it harder. I know how he operates. I've been keeping his books for 5 years. He will have a plan in place before noon today. We need to be ahead of it." Cole looked back toward the ranch. Clara watched his face reading it the way she read numbers, looking for the shape of what was underneath the surface presentation. He was not a simple man. She had understood that in the first 30 seconds of watching him at the fence. He had walked into a corral full of armed men with the particular quality of someone who has learned to manage danger, not by eliminating it, but by understanding it well enough to move through it without setting it off. And that required a kind of intelligence and patience that she recognized because she had spent 5 years developing the same skills in her own very different context. He had done something today that cost him something. She didn't know what yet, but she knew enough about how powerful men operated in this territory to understand that Cole Maddox had just made an enemy of Nathaniel Crowe, which meant he had complicated his own life considerably in order to prevent something terrible from happening to a woman he had never met before this morning. That mattered. She didn't have time to fully examine why it mattered, but it did. "I can get you to Silver Creek," he said finally. "That's 2 days' ride. There's a lawyer there, woman named Ruth Calloway, does contract law. She knows Booth. She'll know the right approach." "How do you know about Ruth Calloway?" "Because I've had reason to use contract lawyers before," he said with an expression that suggested the story behind that statement was long and not entirely comfortable to tell. "She's good, she's cautious, and she won't dismiss you." Clara considered this. 2 days, she said. 2 days. Maybe less if we don't stop much. He looked at her. "You all right to ride?" "I'm all right to do whatever needs doing," Clara said. "That's not the question I'd ask in your position." "What's the question you'd ask?" "Whether I'm going to cause you more trouble than you've already signed yourself up for." She looked at him steadily. "Because I need you to understand something before we go any further. I am not interested in running. I am not interested in disappearing quietly into some other territory and rebuilding a small life and hoping Nathaniel Crowe doesn't expand his operation to wherever I've gone. I want to destroy what he's built. I want every name in that ledger to have their debt recognized as fraudulent and canceled. I want him in front of a court." She paused. "That is a significant amount of trouble, and you should know exactly what you're agreeing to before we leave this property." Cole Maddox looked at her for a long, considering moment. Then he said, "Miss Whitmore." "Clara," she said. "Clara." He took a breath. "I didn't stop back there to give you a head start. I stopped back there because what was happening was wrong, and wrong things don't get less wrong when you ride around them." He gathered his horse's reins. "I know what I'm signing up for. I've been doing complicated things in difficult territory for a long time." He paused. "So, do you want to stand here comparing the scope of the trouble we're in, or do you want to go to Silver Creek and talk to Ruth Calloway?" Clara was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. "Silver Creek," she said. "Then let's go." He brought his horse around and they walked away from Crow Ranch as the morning sun climbed and the 60 men in the corral were left to reckon with what they had witnessed and what it meant and what they were going to tell Nathaniel Crowe when he asked them, as he inevitably would, what they intended to do about it. Clara did not look back a second time. She had what she needed. She had her memory intact and detailed every fraudulent entry from that hidden ledger stored precisely where Nathaniel Crowe could not reach it. She had 2 days to Silver Creek. She had a lawyer named Ruth Calloway, who knew a federal judge. And she had Cole Maddox walking beside her complicated history, and all who had ridden into a corral full of armed men and made something stop that should never have started. She did not know yet what to make of him, but she knew this. He had looked at 60 men choosing silence and refused to add himself to the number. That was not nothing. In fact, in the territory Clara Whitmore had spent her whole life navigating, it was one of the rarest things she had ever seen. She intended to make it count. They rode for 3 hours before either of them said anything of substance. That suited Clara fine. She wasn't a woman who filled silence with noise. Silence was useful. Silence gave you room to think, and she had a great deal to think about the shape of the case she needed to build the sequence in which she would need to present what she remembered from the hidden ledger, the specific legal language that a federal circuit judge would require before he could act, and the considerable problem of the fact that every piece of physical evidence she might have used was currently sitting behind a false panel in Nathaniel Crowe's private office, while Crowe himself was almost certainly making arrangements to ensure it stayed there or ceased to exist entirely. She catalogued everything she remembered. Names, Figures, dates, the specific structure of the fraudulent fee system. She ran through it methodically, the way she ran through account books when she was looking for errors line by line, column by column, checking each entry against the others for internal consistency. Her memory was not perfect, but it was close. And the pattern was so systematic, so deliberately designed, that once you understood the structure of it, the individual entries became almost secondary. The architecture of the fraud was its own evidence. Cole Maddox rode beside her without speaking, which she appreciated, and without watching her too carefully, which she appreciated even more. He had given her a horse from his own pack animal's load, a quiet, steady bay mare who seemed unbothered by the morning's events, unlike virtually every human present, and he had handed Clara her reins and mounted up and started riding north without a production about it. She had noticed the way he positioned himself, always slightly ahead when the terrain was uncertain, always slightly behind when the path was clear. Not protecting exactly, or not only protecting. Managing variables. Reading the landscape continuously for things that might require a response. Military training, she thought, or bounty hunting. The two produced similar habits. It was almost noon when he spoke. "You said the notebook is gone," he said. "How much did you get through before they found it?" 41 names, Clara said. "That's what I'd documented fully before they took it. But I'd read further than that. I can give a complete account of at least 60 entries from memory." "How far back?" 11 years of records. The earliest entries I can speak to with confidence go back 8 years. The more recent entries, the last 3 years, I remember almost in their entirety. I was familiar with the account system by then. I knew what I was looking at. "And the fee structure." "The fee structure is the most important element," Clara said. "It's the mechanism that makes the whole thing work." A legitimate debt at the rate Crow claimed to charge would have been eliminated within 2 years for most workers at their wage level. The hidden fees, the housing assessment, the tool usage levy, the administrative processing charge, the what he called the territory operation, cost added between 40 and 60% to the monthly total. None of those fees appeared in the official books. All of them appeared in the hidden ledger. "That's not just fraud," Cole said. "That's a deliberate system." "It's both. And the distinction matters legally. Individual fraud cases are settled individually. A systematic scheme operates under different statutes, ones with significantly higher penalties, and ones that make it considerably harder for Crow to claim ignorance or clerical error." She glanced at him. "Does Ruth Calloway handle that level of case?" "She handled a water rights case 3 years ago that took down 4 ranchers who'd been diverting a shared river for a decade," Cole said. Same principle, individual acts that together constituted a pattern of coordinated theft. She built the case on testimony and secondary documents when the primary evidence was inaccessible. He paused. "She'll know what to do with what you have." "You know her well." "Well enough." "That's a careful answer." "I'm a careful man." "You were not especially careful this morning," Clara said. Something shifted in his expression, not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. "This morning was a calculated decision," he said, "not an impulsive one. I spent approximately 45 seconds assessing the situation before I dismounted. 45 seconds to decide to draw your gun against 60 men. I wasn't drawing against 60 men. I was drawing to create a moment of reconsideration." He glanced at her. "There's a difference. If I'd wanted a fight, I'd have come in differently. I came in slow and quiet because I wanted those 60 men to have time to think. A crowd that's thinking is a crowd that's already divided. A divided crowd doesn't fight." Clara studied him for a moment. "You've done that before." "I've done variations of it," he said. "The specifics change. The principle holds." "What principle?" "That most men in a crowd aren't fully committed to what the crowd is doing. They're committed to not being the first one to break with it. Give them a reason to reconsider without giving them a reason to feel personally threatened, and a significant portion of them will stand down on their own." He paused. "The 4 or 5 who were genuinely committed to following Crow's orders, those I was watching, not the crowd." Clara was quiet for a moment, processing this. "You named Gerald Pruitt in your count," she said. "The senior hand. I saw you look at him specifically." "Pruitt was a problem," Cole said. "He's been with Crow long enough that his identity is tied up in the operation. Men like that don't back down because the odds shift. They back down because their employer tells them to." He paused. "That's why I addressed Crow directly. Pruitt wasn't going to move until Crow moved." "You read all of that in 45 seconds. "I read people quickly," Cole said. "It's a survival skill." "So is reading account books," Clara said. "And neither of us uses our skill for the purpose people assumed we would when they first noticed we had it." He looked at her sideways at that. A longer look than the quick sideways glances he'd been giving her since they rode out. "No," he said after a moment. "I suppose not." They stopped at a creek midway through the afternoon to water the horses. And that was when Clara first felt the full weight of what she hadn't let herself feel during the morning. The fear that had been sitting beneath the surface of her composure since the moment they locked her in that storage room, and the exhaustion of 3 days without proper sleep, and the particular quality of shaking that comes not during a crisis, but immediately after it, when the body finally receives permission to register what the mind forced it to ignore. She was crouched at the creek's edge with her hands in the cold water when it hit her, and she made a sharp, involuntary sound. Half breath, half something, she refused to classify, and pressed her wet hands against her face, and breathed deliberately the way her mother taught her. Breathe first, then think, then act. She heard Cole's footsteps stop a few feet behind her. He didn't speak. He didn't move closer. He simply stopped and stayed and let the silence be what it was. After a minute, she straightened up. "I'm all right," she said. "I didn't ask," he said. "Most people would have." "Most people ask because they want reassurance," he said. "I don't need reassurance. Take the time you need." She turned to look at him. He was leaning against a tree, arms folded, looking at the water, not at her. Giving her privacy within proximity, she realized which was a specific and considered choice. "How long have you been doing this?" she asked. "Stopping things." He considered the question seriously. "About 8 years, he said. "On and off. I was a bounty hunter for a while before that. Then a lawman's deputy in 2 different territories. Then for about a year, I was neither of those things and didn't have a clear idea of what I was doing. Then I found my sister's trail and followed it." He paused. "And at the end of it, I found out I was too late, but I also found out how the system that took her worked. And once you understand how something like that works, you can't unknow it. You start seeing the machinery of it everywhere. Did you ever find the man responsible for her?" The pause before he answered told her most of what she needed to know. "Yes," he said. "What happened?" "He's not doing what he was doing before," Cole said simply and finally. She understood that was all the answer she was going to get, and she didn't push. They reached the edge of a small settlement as the sun was lowering a collection of buildings along a single main road that called itself Arlen, which appeared in no map Clara had ever seen, but which Cole navigated toward with the ease of a man who knew it existed because he had been here before. He led them to a building near the end of the road, not the largest building in town, but one that had a light in the window and a woman sitting on the porch in a rocking chair who looked up at the sound of their approach without any particular alarm, which suggested she was accustomed to people arriving unexpectedly. The woman was perhaps 60, gray-haired and sharp-eyed, with the practical, unhurried manner of someone who has been managing difficult situations for long enough that very few situations strike her as genuinely difficult anymore. "Cole Maddox," she said. "Last time you came through here, you left me with a busted fence and a federal marshal asking questions for 3 days." "Martha," Cole said, dismounting. "This is Clara Whitmore. She needs a meal and a safe place to sleep. We're heading to Silver Creek tomorrow." Martha Bell looked at Clara with the particular comprehensive assessment of a woman who has seen a great many people arrive at her door carrying things they can't name and has learned to read the weight of those things accurately. "Crow Ranch," she said. Clara went still. "How did you know that?" "Because you have the look, Martha said, standing up from the rocking chair. I had it once myself, about 6 years ago. She opened the front door. Come inside, both of you. Martha Bell had worked at Crow Ranch for 4 years before she left, and she had left only because she had managed to save enough a laborious secret inch-by-inch accumulation over 4 years to pay what Crow claimed was her remaining debt, though she had long since understood the debt was fictional, and paying it was simply the price of escape. She told this to Clara over a supper that she served without ceremony and with a quiet efficiency that suggested feeding people who needed it was something she did regularly. How many women did you know? Clara asked. From the ranch. Who went through the same thing? Personally, Martha counted on her fingers. 7. 3 of them I know are still there. 2 I lost track of completely. 1 died, she was older, the work was too heavy for her. And 1 got out the same way I did. She set down her fork. There's a woman named Agnes Hooper in a town called Porter's Crossing about 40 miles east. She left Crow Ranch 9 years ago. She has her own story, and she's been telling it to anyone who'll listen for years. Nobody in authority has ever taken her seriously. Clara looked at Cole. Cole was already thinking what she was thinking. Porter's Crossing is 6 hours east of Silver Creek, he said. Agnes Hooper, Clara repeated, and she committed the name to the same careful place in her memory where she kept the ledger entries. What does she remember? Everything, Martha said. Agnes has a memory like a courthouse record, and she kept physical evidence letters that Crow sent written receipts for payments she made that never appeared in his official accounts. She paused. She's tried to use them. Nobody listened. A federal circuit judge will listen, Clara said. Martha looked at her steadily. You're planning to take this to Booth. Clara stared at her. You know about Harlan Booth. I know about every judge, lawyer, and territorial official within 500 miles who might conceivably care about what Nathaniel Crow has been doing for 11 years, Martha said flatly. I've had 6 years to research it. The problem has never been information. The problem has been getting anyone with authority to act on it. That's going to change, Clara said. Martha studied her for a long moment. How? Because this time it's not one woman with a story, Clara said. This time I have the structure of the fraud. I have names and numbers and dates and the specific mechanism he uses documented from the inside of his own record-keeping system. And if Agnes Hooper has physical evidence that corroborates the pattern, she stopped. Martha, is there anything else you have? Anything from your time at the ranch that you've kept? Martha was very still. Then she pushed back from the table and walked to the back of the house. They heard a door open, a pause, a door close. She came back carrying a tin box. She set it on the table and opened it. Inside were 5 years of careful, meticulous documentation. Every interaction she could remember, written down the day after she left, while her memory was still fresh. Cross-referenced with dates she'd tracked privately during her time at the ranch, and 3 letters from Crow himself that she had kept because some instinct told her they would matter one day. Clara read every word. When she looked up, her eyes were bright. You've been waiting for this, she said. For 6 years, Martha said. I stopped believing it was going to come. She looked at Clara. Then you walked up my road. Cole was quiet through all of this, but Clara noticed the way he was watching, not passively, but with the focused attention of a man who was building something in his mind, assembling pieces and testing their weight, and checking them against each other the way she checked account entries. There's a problem, he said when Clara set the last letter down. Both women looked at him. Crow is not going to sit still, he said. He had 60 witnesses this morning to what happened at his corral. He knows Clara is gone. He knows she has information he can't retrieve. He knows I'm involved. He paused. He's been operating this system for 11 years without serious legal threat. He has money, and he has connections, and he has 60 men who owe him their livelihoods. He's going to move. He looked at Clara. How quickly can he reach someone in Cheyenne? The question landed cold. Clara thought it through, running the calculations with the same precision she applied to account books. He has a contact in the territorial government. she said slowly. I saw correspondence, nothing I can quote precisely, but the relationship was clear. He's used that contact before to delay administrative reviews. She paused. If he reaches that contact before we reach Booth, he buries the case before it starts. Cole finished. The table was quiet. Martha was the one who spoke. Then you can't take 2 days, she said. You can't take 1 day. You need to move tonight. Cole shook his head. The horses need rest. So does Clara. Riding through the night on tired horses across that terrain. I can ride, Clara said. I know you can ride, he said, looking at her directly, and the steadiness of it was almost physical the way it landed. That's not what I'm questioning. I'm questioning whether arriving in Silver Creek tomorrow morning exhausted and on worn horses serves the case better than arriving tomorrow afternoon rested and able to think clearly. We could leave before dawn, Clara said. 4 hours of sleep. The horses rest until 3. We ride at 3. Cole looked at the window, calculating. We'd make Silver Creek by early afternoon. Yes, and Porter's Crossing. East of Silver Creek, Martha said. If you reach Ruth Calloway early enough tomorrow afternoon, you could send word to Agnes Hooper to come in. She would come. She's been waiting longer than I have. Cole looked at Clara. Clara looked back at him. 3 o'clock, he said. 3 o'clock, she agreed. She slept deeply for the first time in 3 days on a cot in Martha's back room, with the tin box on the floor beside her. And if she dreamed, she didn't remember it when Martha's hand on her shoulder brought her back to wakefulness at 2:45. The stars were still out when they rode. Cole set the pace faster than the afternoon's travel, steady and relentless, the kind of riding that eats distance without drama. The darkness was not complete. There was a moon, partial but sufficient, and Cole moved through the terrain with the confidence of someone who has navigated difficult ground at night before. Clara rode beside him and thought. She thought about the case. She thought about the sequence. She thought about the specific words she would use when she sat down in front of Ruth Calloway, because she had learned long ago that how you present information determines how it is received, and she was going to present this information with the precision and organization and thoroughness that 5 years of maintaining Nathaniel Crow's account books had trained her to bring to everything she considered worth doing. She thought about the women whose names she carried in her memory. 41, documented, 60 recalled. How many more she hadn't reached in the ledger before they found her notebook? How many more in the years before the ones she'd read? She thought about the weight of other people's stolen years. She thought about Agnes Hooper, 40 miles away, who had been telling her story for 9 years to people who hadn't listened and who had kept her physical evidence anyway, as if some part of her had always believed that one day someone would arrive who would know what to do with it. You've gone quiet, Cole said. I'm thinking, Clara said, about the case. About the women, she said. The names I remember, the ones I don't. She paused. When I found that ledger, I thought I was looking at a crime, a serious crime, the kind that deserved legal remedy, and it is that. She paused again. But looking at Martha's face tonight, knowing about Agnes Hooper keeping letters in a box for 9 years, it's not just a crime. It's the systematic erasure of people. They weren't just robbed of money or wages. They were robbed of the ability to exist in the world on their own terms. That's... She stopped. Yeah, Cole said quietly. It is. Your sister, Clara said. What was her name? A long silence. Josephine, he said. Joe mostly. She was 23. He kept his eyes ahead. She had a plan. She was going to open a boarding house in Denver. She'd been saving since she was 16. The man who trapped her, his contract dissolved her savings into the debt repayment. She had nothing. He paused. By the time I found her trail and followed it to its end, there was nothing left to follow. She'd been gone for 2 years. I'm sorry, Clara said. And then because she was Clara Whitmore, and she didn't leave important things unasked. Did you ever find out what happened to her? Specifically, no, he said. I don't know if she's alive somewhere I haven't found yet, or if... He stopped. I don't know. If she's alive, Clara said carefully. And if she's somewhere with a false name or no name, the way women disappear when a system like Crow's is done with them, the legal case we're building could find her. Or find information that leads to her. Public proceedings, federal records, the kind of visibility that reaches. I know, he said. His voice was flat, and she understood it was flat because it was the only way he could hold that particular thought without it becoming something larger than he could manage on horseback at 3 in the morning. I know. She didn't say anything else about it, but she filed it in the same careful place where she kept everything important, and she made herself a quiet promise that it would be part of what she was working toward when they reached Silver Creek. Not just justice for the women she knew about, but a record thorough enough that the women she didn't know about might be found. Silver Creek announced itself in the pale early morning as a proper town larger than Arlen, with a functioning main street and several substantial buildings, and the particular energy of a place that considered itself a commercial center for the surrounding territory. Cole navigated them to a building set slightly back from the main street, 2 stories, with a wooden sign that simply read, Callaway Legal Services. He knocked. A long pause. Then, a voice from inside, brisk and unimpressed. We are not open. Ruth, Cole said. It's Cole Maddox. Another pause, shorter this time. Then the sound of a bolt being drawn. The woman who opened the door was perhaps 50, with iron-gray hair pulled back without ceremony, and sharp eyes that moved immediately from Cole to Clara, and began their assessment without any pretense of social delay. You look like you haven't slept, she said to Clara. I slept 4 hours, Clara said. It was sufficient. It wasn't. Ruth stepped back and opened the door wider. Come in, both of you. Ruth Callaway's office was organized with the ferocious efficiency of a person who considered disorder a form of disrespect toward the work. Files arranged by category and date. Reference books placed with their spines aligned. A desk that was covered in documents, but covered in a way that had clear logic to it. Working materials in active use, not chaos. Clara recognized it immediately. She had kept Crow's official books the same way. She liked Ruth Callaway before the woman said another word. Ruth listened to everything Clara told her without interrupting once. She sat behind her desk with her hands folded and her eyes moving occasionally to a notepad where she was making brief marks in a shorthand Clara didn't recognize. And she let the entire account unfold at Clara's pace and in Clara's order without trying to redirect or reframe or ask clarifying questions until Clara reached the end. Then she asked 3 questions. Sharp, precise surgical questions about the specific structure of the fee system, the specific statutory language that applied to the territory's labor contract regulations, and the specific nature of the corroborating evidence Martha Bell had provided. Clara answered all 3 fully. Ruth picked up her pen and made a longer note. The contact in the territorial government, Ruth said. You believe Crow is moving to use that connection to interfere with a federal inquiry? Yes, Clara said. Today, if he hasn't already. He hasn't, Ruth said. I would have heard, but today is not impossible. She looked at Cole. You made a scene at the ranch. A controlled scene, Cole said. 60 witnesses, Ruth said. Crow will be managing the narrative of what those 60 men say as his first priority. That will take him most of today. He'll move on the political contact tomorrow at the earliest. She looked at Clara. Which means we have today. What do we do with today? Clara asked. Ruth stood up from her desk. I send a wire to Harlan Booth's circuit office, she said, already moving toward the door, requesting an emergency deposition hearing on grounds of active evidence destruction risk. I have used that provision twice before. Booth has granted it both times. She paused at the door. I also send a rider to Porter's Crossing. Clara went still. You know Agnes Hooper? Ruth turned to look at her. Agnes Hooper has been trying to get into my office for 4 years, she said. Every time she came, I had to turn her away because she didn't have enough. The individual testimony wasn't sufficient to build a case on its own. She paused. Now you're sitting in my office. Now I have the framework of the fraud from inside the operation. Now, Agnes Hooper's physical evidence becomes corroborating documentation rather than a single, unsubstantiated claim. Something moved in her expression, not quite emotion, but the recognition of a long patience reaching its conclusion. "Send for Agnes Hooper." Cole was already at the door. He left to arrange the rider. In the quiet that followed, Ruth looked at Clara across the office with the assessing directness of a woman who has spent decades reading people quickly and accurately. "How are you holding together?" she asked. "I'm holding," Clara said. "That's not what I asked." Clara met her eyes. "I'm angry," she said. "I've been angry for 3 weeks, and I've been keeping it underneath everything else because anger isn't useful in the middle of a crisis. But it's there." She paused. "It's going to be very useful in a deposition." The corner of Ruth's mouth moved. "Yes," she said. "It is." She sat back down at her desk. "Crow made a mistake. Not the mistake you're thinking of, not letting you find the ledger, not underestimating what you remembered. The mistake he made was believing that the most dangerous thing about you was your information." "What's the most dangerous thing about me?" Clara asked. "The fact that you're not afraid of him anymore," Ruth said. "People who aren't afraid of powerful men are extraordinarily difficult to stop." The wire went out within the hour. The rider left for Porter's Crossing before noon. And in Crow's Ranch, 40 miles south, a messenger arrived from the ranch owner's office in the territorial capital, a carefully worded letter of inquiry, addressed to a mid-level official in Cheyenne, designed to begin the quiet process of ensuring that any legal proceedings initiated against the Crow Ranch operation would encounter the appropriate friction. The official received the letter. Read it, set it on his desk, and then, because he was a man who made his decisions based on where the momentum was running, and because the wire that had arrived at his office that same morning from a federal circuit judge's office carried a weight that no ranch owner's letter could match, he set it aside without acting on it and returned to his other correspondence. Crow's first line of defense had failed without him knowing it yet. And in Ruth Calloway's office in Silver Creek, Clara Whitmore sat at a desk she'd been given in the corner of the room and wrote down every name she remembered from Nathaniel Crow's hidden ledger in the order they appeared, with as many details attached to each entry as her meticulous memory could reconstruct. She wrote for 3 hours without stopping. Cole came back from arranging the rider and found her there, and he brought her coffee without comment, and she said thank you, without looking up, and he sat down in the chair across the room and waited with the same quiet, focused patience she'd noticed in him since the beginning. The patience of a man who understood that some work couldn't be rushed. When she finally set her pen down, her hand was cramped and her eyes ached, and she had 12 pages of carefully organized documentation sitting in front of her. She looked up. Cole was watching her. 61 names, she said. "I'm confident in 61. There may be more that come to me over the next few days as the pressure of the immediate situation releases and the memories surface more clearly." 61 is enough, Cole said. "It's enough to begin," Clara said. "Not enough to finish." She looked at the pages in front of her. "Agnes Hooper will have more, and Martha's letters will fill in gaps that my memory may have softened." She picked up the pages and straightened them carefully. "When will the rider reach Porter's Crossing?" "Late afternoon," Cole said. "If Agnes can leave immediately, she'll be here by tomorrow morning." Clara nodded. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Cole." "Yeah, when this is over," she stopped, started again. "Whatever happens in front of Judge Booth, whether the case succeeds fully or partly, or—" She stopped again because she was not someone who readily said things she wasn't certain of. And she wasn't certain of this, wasn't certain she should say. It wasn't certain what it would mean if she did. "When it's over," Cole said carefully and simply, "we figure out what comes next." She looked at him. He met her gaze with the same directness she'd seen in him since the beginning. Steady, plain, offering nothing false and withholding nothing true. "All right," she said. "All right," he agreed. Outside Silver Creek went about its afternoon, indifferent to the particular significance of what was being assembled inside Ruth Calloway's office. 61 names on 12 pages of careful, precise documentation. a tin box of letters on their way from Martha Bell's house, and a woman in Porter's Crossing who was going to receive a rider's knock on her door before sundown, and find out that the day she had been keeping her evidence for had finally arrived. 40 miles south, Nathaniel Crow was managing 60 witnesses and composing careful letters and making plans. He did not yet know that the first of those plans had already failed. He did not yet know that before tomorrow's sun was fully up, Agnes Hooper would be sitting in Silver Creek with a box of letters that corroborated every line Clara Whitmore had spent 3 hours writing from memory. He did not yet know that the woman he had tried to mark as his property had spent her first full day of freedom building the architecture of his destruction with the same methodical precision she had brought to every account book he had ever trusted her to keep. But he would know very soon. Agnes Hooper arrived at dawn. Clara heard the horse before she saw the woman, a single rider coming up the main street of Silver Creek at a pace that said she had not slept and had not cared that the rider had received a message and made a decision and acted on it without stopping to weigh the inconvenience. Clara was already awake, already sitting at the desk in Ruth's office with coffee going cold beside her, because sleep had become a thing that happened in pieces around the edges of everything else she was carrying. She stood when the door opened. Agnes Hooper was perhaps 55, lean and weathered in the way of women who had worked outdoors for years, with gray threaded through dark hair, and eyes that had the particular quality Clara had started to recognize. The quality of someone who had been right about something important for a very long time and had been told they were wrong so consistently that they had stopped expecting to be believed without having stopped believing themselves. She stopped in the doorway and looked at Clara. "You were inside the operation," she said, not a question. "5 years," Clara said. "I kept his books." Agnes Hooper closed her eyes for 1 second. 1 single second, and in that second, Clara saw something pass through the woman's face that had the weight of 9 years behind it. Then Agnes opened her eyes and held up the bag she was carrying. "I have everything," she said. They spread Agnes's materials across Ruth's desk as the early morning light came through the windows, and what Clara saw stopped her breath for a moment before her training took over, and she began to read and organize and cross-reference with the focused attention she brought to every set of numbers that didn't yet make sense. Agnes had kept more than letters. She had kept receipts, handwritten, signed, dated receipts for payments she had made against her debt, 17 of them over 4 years, totaling an amount that by any legitimate accounting should have reduced her original obligation to nearly zero. She had kept a personal journal that logged her daily hours, the tasks performed, and the wages she was told she had earned against the debt. She had kept 2 letters from Crow, one that established the original debt terms, and one sent 18 months into her service that introduced the additional fee categories in language that was deliberately obscure, but that a person with Clara's accounting background could decode with absolute clarity. And she had kept something else. A list of names. Her own list compiled from memory over 9 years of every woman she had known at Crow Ranch during her 4 years of service. 14 names, their approximate ages, the debts they carried as Agnes had understood them. What had happened to each one as far as she knew? 3 of them matched names Clara had in her 61. 11 of them were new. Clara set Agnes's list beside her own documentation and looked at the combined total. 72 names, 11 years. She made herself breathe before she spoke. "Agnes," she said, "the letter that introduced the additional fees, the second one. When Crow sent this, did he send similar letters to other workers?" Agnes looked at her. "He sent them to everyone. It was presented as a routine administrative update. We were told to sign a receipt confirming we had received the notification." "Did you sign?" "I signed." "Do you have your copy?" Agnes reached into the bag and produced it. Clara's hands were perfectly steady when she took it, because she had learned long ago to keep her hands steady when her mind was moving very fast and she needed to not frighten the people around her with the intensity of what she was seeing. The receipt was signed by Agnes Hooper and countersigned by Gerald Pruitt Crow's senior hand, acting as ranch administrator. It was dated It was formatted with specific language that read against the fraudulent fee structure Clara had documented from the hidden ledger, constituted a contractual instrument that gave the fraud its legal wrapper, the mechanism Crow used to claim that the additional fees had been disclosed and agreed to. He had every worker sign one of these, Clara said. Yes, Agnes said, and he kept the original copies. He kept everything. Clara set the receipt down with the same care she gave to fragile things. Ruth, she said. Ruth Calloway, who had been standing at the corner of the desk reading along with Clara in silence, looked up. This changes the nature of the case, Clara said. The signed receipts are in his files. If they can be obtained legally through the deposition process or a federal warrant, they transform every worker's documented debt from a verbal arrangement into a written contractual fraud. That's a different statute. It's a conspiracy charge, Ruth said. Her voice was very controlled. Systematic, documented, contractually bound conspiracy to defraud multiple individuals across an extended period. She paused. That is not a territorial matter. That is a federal matter. The word landed in the room like something physical. Federal. Federal jurisdiction meant Crow's contact in the territorial government became irrelevant. Federal jurisdiction meant a level of authority that no amount of local influence could quietly redirect. Agnes Hooper looked between them. What does that mean? It means, Clara said, that Nathaniel Crow is not going to be able to make this go away. The wire to Judge Booth's circuit office had gone out the previous morning. Ruth had framed it carefully, not a speculative complaint, but a documented request for emergency deposition proceedings based on active evidence destruction risk and the involvement of multiple complaining parties across a multi-year fraud. By noon, a response arrived. Ruth read it twice before she brought it to Clara. Booth will convene an emergency deposition in Cheyenne in 3 days, she said. He's granting the evidence preservation order, which means Crow cannot legally destroy or move any business records from the ranch property as of this morning. If he does, it becomes obstruction. Can the order be enforced? Clara asked. He has 60 men. The order is signed by a federal circuit judge, Ruth said, which means it is enforced by federal marshals, not territorial deputies, not local sheriffs. Federal. She paused. Cole. Cole, who had been standing by the window with his arms folded, straightened. I know 2 marshals in this territory, he said. Both of them have dealt with Crow-adjacent situations before, and neither of them owes him anything. He was already reaching for his hat. I'll send word. And Cole, Ruth said. He stopped. Be careful how you move today. Crow will have people watching this town by this afternoon. Cole looked at Clara. Clara looked back at him. Something passed between them, an acknowledgement, a recognition of what the next 72 hours were going to require and what was at stake in them. I'm always careful, he said. You drew your gun against 60 men yesterday morning, Ruth said. That was a calculated decision, Cole said. Go, Ruth said. He went. The watching started before noon. Clara noticed at first a man she didn't recognize sitting in the street outside with a newspaper and an interest in Ruth's building that was slightly too sustained to be incidental. She didn't say anything about it to Agnes, who was working through her own documents with Ruth, but she filed the location and the face and the time. By 2 in the afternoon, there were 2 of them. When Cole came back at 3, she told him before he'd gotten his hat off. 2, she said. 1 at the northeast corner, 1 farther down the street near the feed store. Neither of them has been inside any of the businesses around here. They arrived within an hour of each other. Cole turned to look at the window without moving toward it. Pruitt's men. Almost certainly. Crow moved faster than I expected, Cole said. And there was something in his voice that was less surprise than recalibration, the sound of a man adjusting a plan he was already holding. He would have moved last night, Clara said. After he finished managing his 60 witnesses, the first thing he would have done was establish eyes on the places I might run to. She paused. He knows I know Ruth Calloway's name. Cole looked at her. How? Because I asked about federal circuit judges within earshot of Gerald Pruitt 3 months ago, Clara said. I was asking generally. I was curious about the judicial system in this territory, the way I'm curious about all systems. Pruitt would have reported it because he reports everything, and Crow would have filed it. She paused. I didn't know then that I would need it, but Crow would have kept the information. He keeps everything. So he knew you'd come here. He suspected. He was right. She looked at the window. They're not here to stop us. If he wanted to stop us, he would have sent Pruitt, not watchers. They're here to document who we talk to identify witnesses before the deposition so he can... She stopped. So he can pressure them, Cole finished. Or worse, Clara said quietly. Agnes appeared in the doorway behind them. She had been listening. Clara realized with the particular attention of someone who has spent 9 years being right about a dangerous man and knows exactly what that danger looks like. He did it to me, Agnes said. When I first went to a lawyer in Porter's Crossing. 2 weeks later, my landlord told me I needed to leave his property. I'd been there 4 years. Never a problem. She paused. A month after that, the merchant where I worked lost his biggest supply contract. He let me go. He didn't say why. He didn't have to. She looked at them steadily. Crow doesn't stop people from talking. He makes sure that every person they depend on pays a price for listening. The room was very quiet. Ruth, Clara said. Ruth appeared from her office. She had clearly heard as well. He's going to go after you, Clara said. It wasn't an apology. It was information delivered with the directness Ruth deserved. If he has watchers here already, he knows you're involved. He knows what that means for the case. He's going to look for your pressure points. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, he already tried. 4 years ago when Agnes first approached me, he had a colleague send a professional complaint to the Territorial Bar Association questioning the basis for a case I'd handled the year before. Nothing came of it because there was nothing to come of anything, but I understood the message. She looked at Clara. I didn't stop seeing clients because of it. And I didn't stop seeing Agnes Hooper because of it. I stopped seeing Agnes Hooper because the case wasn't ready. She paused. It's ready now. He'll try harder this time, Clara said. Let him try. Ruth said with a flatness that was not bravado, but something quieter and more durable. I've been practicing law in this territory for 22 years. I'm not easy to move. Cole had been thinking while they talked, and Clara could read the specific quality of his silence, the working silence, not the waiting silence. The deposition is 3 days away, he said. Cheyenne is a 2-day ride. We need to leave tomorrow at the latest. He looked at Clara and Agnes. Both of you. Both of us in Cheyenne, Agnes said, and something moved in her voice. Not fear, but the particular vertigo of something you have imagined for 9 years suddenly becoming a concrete next morning. Together, Clara said. Everything we have goes in front of Booth simultaneously. Your physical evidence, my documented testimony. Martha Bell's letters. Martha's coming, Agnes said. I'm going to ask her, Clara said. She has Crow's letters, original signed letters. In a fraud case with federal jurisdiction, original correspondence from the perpetrator that corroborates the scheme is Agnes. It's significant. It's very significant. Agnes sat down in the nearest chair. For a moment she said nothing. Then, 9 years, she said. I've been carrying those letters for 9 years. I moved 3 times. I carried the box every time. People thought I was holding on to a grudge. My sister told me I needed to let it go. She looked up. I told her I'd let it go when someone in authority told me I was right. A pause. Was I right to keep them? Yes, Clara said. You were right. Agnes pressed her lips together and looked at the ceiling for 1 moment. Then she looked back down. Then let's go to Cheyenne. Cole sent word to Martha Bell that afternoon through a rider he trusted, a young man named Denny, who had done work for him before. and who had the useful quality of being able to move through the territory without attracting the kind of attention that Gerald Pruitt's watchers were trained to notice. The message was simple: bring the tin box leave before first light, meet them at the crossroads north of Arlen. The response came back 3 hours later. Martha would be there. What none of them knew, what Clara was still assembling in pieces from everything she had read and heard and filed in her careful memory over the past 2 days, was that the situation was more complicated than a 3-sided fraud case with strong testimony and corroborating evidence. She realized it that evening. She was going back through Agnes's documents one more time, cross-referencing the names on Agnes's list against her own 61 when she found it. Not a name, a notation. Something Agnes had written in her personal journal 9 years ago and apparently hadn't registered as significant because she hadn't had the accounting context to understand what she was looking at. 3 lines. A reference to a visit at Crow Ranch from a man Agnes described only as the man from the land office. A note that Crow had seemed agitated after the visit. And the date. Clara read the date. She read it again. Then she went very still. The date was 4 days after the earliest entry in the hidden ledger, the first recorded instance of the fraudulent fee structure being applied to a worker's account. The land office. She sat with that for a long moment, turning it in her mind the way you turn a mismatched entry in an account book, looking at it from every angle, checking it against everything else she knew. Crow's Ranch was substantial. 30,000 acres. The kind of land holding in Wyoming Territory in 1884 that required either an original land grant, a series of legal purchases, or Clara's mind moved through the possibilities with the systematic precision she could not switch off a relationship with the Territorial Land Office that made the accumulation and maintenance of that holding significantly easier than it would otherwise have been. She thought about the contact in the territorial government that she had seen referenced in Crow's correspondence. She had assumed it was a general political connection, the kind of relationship wealthy men maintained with officials as a matter of course. But what if it wasn't general? What if it was specific? What if Nathaniel Crow's relationship with the territorial government wasn't about protecting his labor fraud? What if the labor fraud was funding something else? What if the women whose stolen wages had flowed into his operation for 11 years were providing the financial foundation for a land acquisition scheme of an entirely different order? She needed to think. She needed space and quiet, and she needed to be wrong because if she was right, the case in front of Judge Booth was not a labor fraud case. It was a land fraud case with a labor fraud attached to it as its financial engine. And land fraud in Wyoming Territory in 1884 was a federal crime of a magnitude that made labor fraud charges look like a misdemeanor by comparison. She found Cole in the room at the back of Ruth's building where he'd been sleeping since they arrived. She knocked twice. He was awake instantly, the way she had come to understand he was always awake instantly. The hair-trigger alertness of someone who had spent years in situations where the difference between a second's delay and no delay was not trivial. "What's wrong?" he said. Not a question. "Nothing's wrong," she said. "Something's bigger than we thought." She told him about Agnes's journal entry, the land office, the date, the pattern she was seeing when she placed it against everything else she knew. Cole was quiet for a long time when she finished. "You're saying the labor fraud is the revenue source," he said slowly. "Not the primary crime. The engine that funds the primary crime." "I'm saying it's possible," Clara said. "I could be wrong. I don't have enough—" "You're not wrong," Cole said. She looked at him. 3 years ago, he said, there was a land dispute in the southern part of this territory. 2 small ranching families lost their properties in what was ruled a legitimate foreclosure proceeding. I was working adjacent to a different matter, same territory. And the thing that bothered me about it was that the foreclosure papers were processed through the land office with a speed that was unusual. Days, not months. A process that should have taken 6 months took less than a week. He paused. The ranch that absorbed both properties was Crow affiliated, not directly. A subsidiary operation, different name. But the supply contracts ran back to Crow. "You looked into it." "I looked at the edge of it," he said. "I couldn't get inside. There was nothing I could attach to directly. He looked at her. But it stayed with me. Because the speed of that processing meant someone in the land office was facilitating it. Not just aware of it, actively facilitating. That's the contact, Clara said. That's what the correspondence I saw was actually about. Not about protecting the labor fraud, about protecting the land acquisitions the labor fraud was funding. If that's true, Cole said carefully, then what we're taking to Booth is not a labor fraud case. No, Clara said. It's the financial infrastructure of a systematic land theft operation that has been running for at least 11 years. Yes. With a government official actively involved. Yes. Cole stood up. He stood up, and he walked to the window, and he stood there for a moment, with his back to her, and she could read the tension in his shoulders. Not fear she had come to understand, but the particular response of someone whose understanding of the scale of a problem has just shifted dramatically and is making the necessary adjustments. This is bigger than Booth, he said. Booth has federal jurisdiction, Clara said. He can expand the scope of proceedings if the evidence warrants it. This will warrant it, Cole said. He turned around. Clara, if Crow understands what you've just understood, if he has any reason to believe you've connected the labor fraud to the land scheme, the watchers outside are not going to be enough for him. The statement sat between them, with the weight it deserved. He doesn't know what I know, Clara said. He thinks the threat is the labor fraud. He doesn't know about Agnes's journal entry. He doesn't know I've made the connection. Yet, Cole said. Yet, she agreed. We leave tonight, Cole said. You said tomorrow. I said tomorrow, assuming this was a labor fraud case with 3 witnesses, Cole said. This is a different calculation. We leave tonight. We collect Martha at the crossroads, and we ride for Cheyenne, and we do not stop anywhere long enough for Crow's people to get ahead of us. He paused. Can you ride tonight? I can ride any time you need me to ride, Clara said. Then go tell Ruth, and tell Agnes. Tell them to take only what they absolutely cannot leave behind. The documents, Clara said. Everything Agnes has, everything Martha has. The 12 pages you wrote your notes from today, all of it comes with us. He was already moving. That evidence does not leave our sight. Clara went to find Ruth. She found her still at her desk. Ruth Calloway apparently operated on a schedule that was largely indifferent to the conventions of nighttime, and she told her quickly and clearly what she had found in Agnes's journal and what it meant. Ruth sat very still while Clara talked. Then she said, The land office official. I believe so, yes. Do you have a name? Not yet, Clara said. But the correspondence I saw at Crow's Ranch, I remember the handwriting on the return address. I remember the postmark. With enough time and the right access to public records, it could be traced. Booth has access to public records that I do not, Ruth said. She stood up. Federal jurisdiction opens doors that no territorial lawyer can open. She looked at Clara directly. You understand what you've done. I found a connection. You found the keystone, Ruth said. The thing the entire arch depends on. The labor fraud was always going to be difficult to prosecute at the scale needed, because each individual worker's case, while provable, requires the court to connect dozens of separate instances into a systematic pattern. But land fraud with documented financial infrastructure and a government official, that's not dozens of cases that need to be connected. That's one case. One large, clear federal case with everything attached. She picked up her coat from the back of her chair. Tell me we're leaving. We're leaving, Clara said. Good. Agnes took the news with the stillness of someone who had long since processed the fact that the danger was real and had decided not to let it govern what she did next. She packed quickly, and without comment, the practiced efficiency of a woman who had rebuilt her life from nothing more than once and knew how to move when moving was necessary. They left Silver Creek at 9 at night, 4 of them. Clara Cole, Ruth Agnes, riding in the darkness with the documents divided between them so that no single loss could take everything. Cole set them moving north and slightly west away from the main road, onto a route that took longer but avoided the obvious paths Crow's watchers would cover. He moved without hesitation, reading the land the way Clara read numbers, instinctively, structurally, understanding the deeper logic beneath the surface detail. They rode for 2 hours before Clara pulled up beside him. "The men watching Ruth's office," she said. "They'll report we've gone." "Yes." "Crow will know we're heading to Cheyenne." "He'll assume it. He can't know which route." "He doesn't need to know the route," Clara said. "He needs to get there before us. Get to someone in Cheyenne who can—" "He won't get to Booth," Cole said. "Booth's a circuit judge who has seen men like Crow his entire career. He's not movable." "But the deposition can be challenged," Clara said. "Procedurally, if Crow's lawyers file an objection to the basis for emergency proceedings." "Ruth anticipated that 3 hours ago," Cole said. "She sent a secondary wire before we left. A backup filing through a federal administrator in Denver who bypasses the territorial legal structure entirely. Booth received it." He glanced at her. "She didn't tell you because she didn't want to add to your list of things to process tonight." Clara was quiet for a moment. "I can process things while I'm writing," she said. "I know you can," he said. "That's not why she didn't tell you." "Then why?" "Because you've been carrying everything," he said simply and plainly. "Every piece of this, every name, every number, every connection. You've been carrying it since you found that ledger 3 weeks ago, and you haven't put it down once." He paused. "She wanted you to have one night where someone else was carrying something." Clara was quiet for a long moment. The darkness around them was deep, but not absolute stars. Overhead, ground visible, the sounds of the horses and the breathing of 3 women who had each in their own way been waiting years for this particular night. "Ruth is a good lawyer," Clara said finally. "She's the best lawyer in this territory," Cole said. "Possibly in the surrounding 3 territories." "Then why hasn't she brought a case like this before?" "Because no one has brought her what you brought her," he said. "The internal perspective, the structural understanding of how the fraud worked from the inside of the bookkeeping system. She's had the edges for years, Agnes's letters, other complaints that came and went. What she's never had until now is the architecture." Clara thought about this. She thought about the 12 pages sitting in the saddlebag behind her, and the 61 names on those pages, and the 72 names when you added Agnes's list, and how many more there might be that she hadn't reached in the ledger before they found her notebook. She thought about Josephine Maddox, 23 years old, with a plan to open a boarding house in Denver, whose trail had ended 8 years ago in a silence her brother still carried. "Cole," she said. "Yeah, the names I don't know, the ones in the ledger I didn't reach. When the federal case opens and the records are subpoenaed. Every record comes out," he said. "Every name. If Josephine was ever processed through a scheme like this one, if her name is somewhere in those records or in records connected to the same network." She felt rather than saw the quality of his stillness. "If she's in there," he said quietly, "we'll find her." "Yes," Clara said, "we will." They reached the crossroads north of Arlen, as the first pale suggestion of morning was beginning to differentiate the sky from the land, and Martha Bell was waiting exactly where she'd said she would be, sitting on her horse, with the tin box secured to her saddle, and an expression that said she had been waiting for some time and was not troubled by it. She looked at the 4 of them as they arrived. "You found more than you expected," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Clara said. "How much more?" "Land fraud," Clara said. "Federal scale. The labor operation was its financial foundation." Martha was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I always wondered where the money was going. He didn't live like a man who was getting rich off ranch hands' wages." She patted the tin box. "Tell me these letters matter more than I thought they did." "They corroborate the financial flow," Clara said. "Yes, they matter considerably more." Martha nodded once with the quiet resolution of a woman whose 6 years of waiting had just been assigned a purpose proportionate to their length. "Then let's not waste any more time," she said. They turned north. Cheyenne was ahead of them, and somewhere in it, a federal circuit judge named Harlan Booth was about to receive the most significant deposition of his career on the Wyoming bench, brought to him by 4 women. 1 outlaw, 12 pages of reconstructed testimony. A tin box of letters. 9 years of Agnes Hooper's careful preservation. And the precise, furious, undefeatable memory of a woman who had spent 5 years keeping the records of the man who was trying to destroy her. Behind them in Crow Ranch, a messenger was saddling a horse. Crow had received word that Ruth Calloway's office was empty. He had understood immediately what it meant. He was already composing his response when the messenger left his face arranged into the careful, controlled expression he used when he was most dangerous. He had underestimated Clara Whitmore once. He would not underestimate her again. But he was already one move behind, and the distance was growing. They reached Cheyenne on the second afternoon, road-worn and quiet, carrying everything they had between them like something too important to set down even for a moment. Ruth went directly to the federal courthouse to confirm the deposition proceedings. Cole went to find the 2 marshals he knew. Martha and Agnes went together to the boarding house Ruth had wired ahead to reserve, and Clara went with them because Cole had asked her to stay off the main streets until he understood what Crow's people had arranged in Cheyenne, and she agreed because she had learned in the past 3 days that Cole Maddox's caution was not the kind that wasted itself on things that didn't matter. She sat in the boarding house room with the 12 pages on the table in front of her and went through everything one more time, not because she had forgotten anything, because she needed to know that every word she was going to say in front of Harlan Booth was exactly right. Not approximately right. Not substantially correct. Exactly right, because Crow's lawyers were going to challenge every figure, every date, every name, and she intended to be the most credible witness they had ever faced in a Wyoming Territory federal proceeding. Agnes sat across from her and worked through her own documents with the same methodical focus. And Martha sat by the window and said nothing, but was present in the way of people whose steadiness is itself a form of support. Ruth came back at 4 in the afternoon, with her coat still on, and her expression carrying news. "Deposition is confirmed for tomorrow morning," she said. 9 o'clock. "Booth has reviewed the preliminary filing and granted an expanded scope of inquiry to include land office transactions." She set her bag on the table. "There's something else." Everyone looked at her. "Crow arrived in Cheyenne this morning," Ruth said. "He brought 2 lawyers and Gerald Pruitt." The room was quiet for a moment. "He moved faster than we did," Clara said. "He took the main road," Ruth said. "Faster but more visible." She paused. "He's filed a preemptive motion challenging the basis for emergency proceedings and requesting a continuance of 60 days pending his legal team's preparation." "Can Booth grant that?" Agnes asked. "He can," Ruth said. "He won't. The evidence preservation order I filed 2 days ago establishes active destruction risk. A 60-day continuance in those circumstances is legally indefensible, and Crow's lawyers know it. They filed it to signal that he intends to fight every procedural inch of this." She looked at Clara. "Which means tomorrow is not a gentle proceeding. They will come at you." "Let them come," Clara said. "I need you to understand what that means specifically," Ruth said, and her voice had the particular quality it carried when she was communicating something important and needed to know it had landed. "They will question your memory. They will suggest your account of the ledger is reconstructed, that you've built it from inference and resentment rather than genuine recall. They will bring Crow's official books, which are clean and consistent, and they will hold them up against your testimony and ask why a judge should believe a former employee's unverified recollection over certified financial records. Because the official books are corroborated by the fraudulent ledger that they don't have access to yet," Clara said. "And because Agnes Hooper's receipts demonstrate the specific discrepancy between what workers were told they owed and what the official books record. And because Martha Bell's letters show Crow himself authorizing fee structures that appear nowhere in his certified records." She paused. "And because I have a very good memory, and I am going to stand in front of Harlan Booth tomorrow and be precise about every single entry I recall, with the same precision I brought to every account book I managed for 5 years, and anyone who has dealt with those books will tell the court that my precision was never in question." She looked at Ruth steadily. "I understand what tomorrow is. I've been preparing for it since I found that ledger. Ruth looked at her for a long moment. Yes, she said quietly. I believe you have. Cole came back at 6 with 2 men Clara hadn't met, both broad-shouldered, both carrying the particular unhurried authority of federal marshals who had been doing the work long enough to have no remaining need to perform it. This is Tom Reeves and Walt Griggs, Cole said. They'll be at the courthouse tomorrow, and they're going to the ranch. Clara looked at him. When? Tonight, Cole said. The evidence preservation order authorizes a federal inspection of Crow's records as of 2 days ago. Every hour the records sit there uninspected is an hour Crow has to make arrangements that circumvent the order without technically violating it. He looked at Reeves. Tom, we leave at 7, Reeves said. He was a compact, direct man with a mustache going gray, and the tone of someone accustomed to being straightforward because it saved time. We'll have Crow's business records, all of them main books, and any secondary materials we locate secured by tomorrow morning and delivered to the courthouse before 9. The hidden panel, Clara said, in his private office, behind the north wall approximately 4 feet from the window. Press the lower left corner of the second wall panel from the right. It swings inward. Reeves looked at her. I kept his books for 5 years, she said. I know that office better than he does. Reeves looked at Cole. Cole gave him a slight nod. Hidden panel, Reeves said, and he wrote it down. The room that night carried a particular quality of tension that was not fear, but was adjacent to it. The specific alertness of people who have built something carefully and are now waiting to find out whether it holds. Martha slept. Agnes sat up for a while and then slept. Ruth worked at the small desk in the corner, and the sound of her pen was steady and continuous for hours. Clara did not sleep until past midnight, and when she did, it was the flat, deep sleep of someone who has finally run out of ways to prepare and has surrendered to the fact that tomorrow will come regardless. She dreamed of numbers, long columns of numbers that were clean and correct, and told the truth about exactly what had been done and to whom. She woke at 5 and felt ready. They arrived at the federal courthouse at 8:30. Crow was already there. Clara saw him from across the entrance hall and felt something settle in her chest. Not calm exactly, but the particular quality of resolution that comes when something you have been moving toward for a long time is finally directly in front of you, and the distance has collapsed to 0. He looked exactly as she remembered, composed, precisely dressed, carrying himself with the absolute assurance of a man who has never had cause to question whether the world would arrange itself according to his preferences. He had 2 lawyers flanking him, and Gerald Pruitt standing slightly behind, and all 4 of them turned when Clara's group entered. Crow's eyes found Clara immediately. She met them without looking away. For 3 seconds across the entrance hall of the federal courthouse in Cheyenne, the 2 of them looked at each other, and Clara thought about the storage room floor, and the burning iron, and 60 men watching in silence, and 5 years of numbers that were never meant to add up to freedom. Then, she walked past him. She had things to do that were more important than him. Harlan Booth was 70 years old, white-haired, and lean in a way that suggested he had been lean his entire life, and considered it simply the natural condition of a person who had better things to attend to than excess. He had the eyes of a man who had heard a great many people say a great many things, and had developed an extremely accurate instrument for distinguishing truth from construction. He read Ruth's complete filing before the session began. Clara knew this because when he entered and took his position and looked at the room, his gaze went first to the documents on his desk and then to Clara, in a way that communicated he already understood what she was here for and why it mattered. "We'll begin," he said. "Miss Whitmore, you are the primary deposing witness." "Yes, sir," Clara said. "You will be sworn and you will give your account. Counsel for the respondent will have opportunity to question following your testimony. I will have questions of my own." He looked at Crow's lawyers. "Counsel will confine itself to relevant lines of inquiry. This proceeding is not a forum for harassment of witnesses." He looked back at Clara. "Whenever you're ready." She was ready. She began with the debt itself, its origin in her father's estate, The terms as she had understood them when she began work at Crow Ranch, the wage structure she had been told, and the repayment schedule she had been led to expect. She spoke clearly and at a measured pace, organizing the information the way she organized account entries in logical sequence with the supporting detail attached to each point, no more and no less than was necessary. Then, she described finding the hidden ledger. She described the panel, the shelf, the book sitting in the dark as if it knew what it contained. She described opening it and reading it and the specific structure of what she found, the fee categories, the notation system, the way the fraudulent charges were logged separately from the official records in a format that was designed to be understood by the person who created it and impenetrable to anyone else without accounting training. The housing assessment fee, she said, was logged in the hidden ledger under the notation HA with a corresponding percentage of the worker's monthly wage total. The standard rate was 22%. This notation and this charge appear in no document in the official account books. The official books record housing as a fixed quarterly deduction of $1.50 per resident worker, a figure that accords with Territorial Labor Board guidelines and is entirely legitimate. The hidden fee represents an additional 22% monthly extraction that was never disclosed to workers, never agreed to in any signed contract, and never appeared in any record to which workers had access. She watched Booth making notes. She continued for 40 minutes. Every fee category, every notation system, every mechanism of the fraud described with the internal consistency of someone who has spent 3 weeks doing nothing but thinking about it, and 5 years learning the accounting language to make it comprehensible. When she finished, Crow's lead lawyer, a man named Alderton, who had the practiced confidence of someone who had done this many times before and expected to do it easily, stood and began his questioning. He did exactly what Ruth had predicted. Miss Whitmore, you are asking this court to accept your recollection of a document you viewed briefly on a single occasion as the foundation for serious federal allegations against an established business operation. I am asking this court to accept my recollection as one component of a multi-source evidentiary body, Clara said. That body includes physical documentation from 2 other witnesses. Your memory is the central claim, Alderton said. Without it, you have letters and receipts that a good accountant could argue are consistent with your subjective misunderstanding of a legitimate business relationship. A good accountant, Clara said, is exactly who you want examining those letters and receipts, because a good accountant will be able to demonstrate from the internal numerical relationships alone that the fee structures they document cannot be reconciled with the official account books without positing the existence of a parallel accounting system, which is what I am describing. Alderton paused. It was a small pause, half a second. But Clara had been reading pauses in professional exchanges for 5 years, and she knew what that particular pause meant. He had not expected that answer. He moved on. He questioned her on dates, on specific figures, on whether she had disclosed to anyone at the ranch her discovery of the ledger before Crow confronted her about it. She answered every question with the same measured precision, never overclaiming, never hedging. Where she was certain, noting specifically, and without apology, the 3 instances in her 61-name testimony where she was confident in the name and the general debt structure, but less certain of a specific figure. Booth noticed this. She saw him note it. Transparency about the limits of her knowledge made everything else she said more credible. She had understood this before she walked in. Alderton sat down after an hour. Then Booth asked his own questions. They were not the questions of a man who was uncertain. They were the questions of a man who had already understood the shape of what he was looking at and was confirming specific dimensions. Miss Whitmore, the fee notation system you described, the HA designation and the others. Were these notations consistent throughout the ledger, or did they vary? Consistent throughout, Clara said. The notation system was established in the earliest entries and maintained with complete regularity across all 11 years of records I viewed. This consistency is itself significant. It indicates a deliberate system created at the outset, not errors or informal practices that developed over time. Indicating premeditation, Booth said. Indicating deliberate design, yes. Booth wrote something. "The land office correspondence you reference," he said. "You indicate you observed this in Crow's office and recall the postmark and handwriting of the return address." "I observed correspondence of that description on at least 3 occasions over my time at the ranch," Clara said. "The postmark was Cheyenne. The handwriting on the return address, I can describe it in detail. It was a distinctive hand, left-leaning, with an unusual formation of the capital letters." "Would you recognize it if you saw it again?" "Yes," Clara said. Booth looked at Reeves and Griggs, who were seated at the side of the room. "Marshal Reeves," he said, "the materials retrieved from Crow Ranch this morning." Reeves stood. "We have them, Your Honor, including materials found in a concealed compartment consistent with the location described by Miss Whitmore." The room changed. It was not a dramatic change. Nobody stood up or cried out or made a sound that would have been noted by an observer listening for disturbance. But the quality of the air in the room changed in the specific way it changes when something that was theoretical becomes factual. Crow's lawyers exchanged a look. Crow himself did not move. He had the discipline of a man who had faced difficult situations before. But Clara, watching him from across the room, with the attention she had developed over 5 years of reading his reactions, saw his right hand close on the arm of his chair and tighten. The hidden ledger was in federal hands. Everything she had described for an hour was sitting in a box on the other side of that room, corroborating every word. Alderton was on his feet immediately. "Your Honor, the manner in which these materials were obtained was authorized by a federal evidence preservation order issued by this court 2 days ago," Booth said without looking up from his notes. "Sit down, counsel." Alderton sat down. Booth looked at Crow directly for the first time since the session began. "Mr. Crow," he said, "your legal counsel will advise you of your options, which at this point are limited and diminishing. I am expanding the scope of this proceeding to include an examination of land office transactions involving your operation dating back 11 years. I am issuing a warrant for the financial records of the land office official whose correspondence was found in your private files." He paused. "Court will recess for 2 hours. When we reconvene, Miss Hooper and Mrs. Bell will present their documentation." He stood. Everyone stood. Booth walked out. In the 2 minutes before the room reorganized itself, Clara sat very still and let herself feel what had just happened. Not the outcome that was still hours and days ahead, still uncertain in its specific shape, even if its direction was now clear. But the moment itself. The moment when the hidden ledger moved from a memory in her head to a physical object in federal custody. The moment when 11 years of deliberate systematic theft became a matter of federal record. She was aware of Cole moving to stand beside her. "How are you holding together?" he asked, and it was almost exactly what Ruth had asked her 2 days ago in Silver Creek. "I'm not shaking," she said. "That's new." "You were never shaking on the outside," he said. "I know," she said. "I was shaking on the inside. I'm not anymore." He was quiet for a moment. "That was remarkable, what you did in there." "It was accurate," she said. "That's all it was. Accurate and organized." She looked at him. "The remarkable part was before. Finding the ledger. Getting out. Getting here. Everything before this room that was the hard part." "You did it," he said simply. "We did it," she said, and she meant the 4 of them herself. Agnes, Martha, Ruth, and she meant him, and she meant Denny the writer, and Tom Reeves, and Walt Griggs, and every small decision and piece of help that had brought them from a storage room floor to a federal courthouse in 2.5 days. The recess brought the first twist that none of them had anticipated. It came in the form of a young man who appeared in the corridor outside the courtroom during the break. Perhaps 25, well-dressed, but with the look of someone for whom the clothing was recently acquired and not yet entirely comfortable. And he asked specifically for Clara Whitmore. Cole was beside her immediately. The young man held up both hands. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said. "My name is Benjamin Crow. Nathaniel Crow is my father." The corridor went very quiet. Clara looked at him. She remembered a name from the original story she'd heard, the son who had disappeared from ranch life years ago, who Crow referred to in correspondence with the cold brevity of someone who had written off a relationship. She hadn't known he was in Cheyenne. "Why are you here?" she said. Benjamin Crow's jaw worked for a moment. He had his father's controlled features, but not his father's control over them. The emotion was closer to the surface, more available, both more vulnerable and more credible for it. "Because I found the second ledger 4 years ago," he said. "I found it by accident, the same way you probably did, and I went to my father and told him what I'd seen." He stopped. "And he told me that what I thought I understood, I didn't understand. And he was so certain. He was always so certain about everything." His voice tightened. "And I was 21, and he was my father, and I told myself he was right, and I put it away." He looked at Clara directly. "I've been putting it away for 4 years. I watched women come to that ranch, and I watched the numbers never change for them, and I kept putting it away." He paused. "I can't put it away anymore." "You want to testify?" Clara said. "I want to tell what I know," he said. "Which is that 4 years ago, the second ledger existed and was in the panel behind the north wall of his office, and my father confirmed to me, in the specific way he had of confirming things without admitting them directly, that the fee system it documented was intentional." He swallowed. "I should have come forward 4 years ago. I know that." Clara looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what it cost him to be standing in this corridor. The specific cost of standing against a parent, not just in law, but in the private architecture of identity and loyalty, and everything that came with 25 years of being someone's son. "You're here now," she said. "I'm here now," he agreed. She looked at Cole. Cole looked at her. "Get Ruth," she said. Ruth appeared 2 minutes later and listened to Benjamin Crow for 4 minutes, and then took him directly into the courtroom to speak with a court official before the session reconvened. The afternoon session was different in quality from the morning. Agnes Hooper presented her receipts and her letters and her 9 years of documented memory with a steadiness that had the particular authority of someone who has told the truth so many times in front of people who didn't believe it. That telling it in front of someone who was actively listening required a moment of adjustment before it became something she allowed herself to trust. Booth asked her 3 questions after her presentation, each one landing exactly on the most important element of each document, and his attention was the attention of a man who was building something in his mind as he listened and knew exactly which pieces he was looking for. Martha Bell's letters went in without challenge. Crow's lawyers attempted an objection about authenticity, and Booth dismissed it before they finished the sentence because the letters carried Crow's own distinctive signature, and Reeves had retrieved matching signature specimens from the ranch's official correspondence files that morning. Benjamin Crow testified last. He was brief, and he was precise, and he was terrible to watch in the way that witnessing someone do a genuinely difficult thing is always a little terrible, because the difficulty is visible and real and not performed. When he said that his father had confirmed the intentional nature of the fee system, the courtroom was completely silent. Crow's lead lawyer Alderton stood. "Your Honor, this witness is a voluntary deponent with first-hand knowledge," Booth said. "His credibility is a matter for the record. Sit down." Alderton sat down for the second time in 4 hours. Clara watched Nathaniel Crow across the room as his son spoke. She had expected to see anger. The cold, controlled fury she knew from his office, the particular stillness he used when he was most dangerous. What she saw instead was something she had not expected. He looked at his son, and for one moment, one single moment that she almost missed, because she was watching for the wrong thing, his expression broke. Not into regret exactly, but into something that had been behind the control all along. Something she didn't have a precise name for, the specific quality of a man watching a consequence arrive that he has always known was coming, but has spent years convincing himself he could prevent. Then the control returned. He looked away from his son and back at the front of the room, and he was Nathaniel Crow again, composed, precise, arranged. But Clara had seen the break, and she understood something she hadn't understood before. He had always known this moment existed. He had built his entire operation around preventing it, controlling it, paying it off, or pressuring it away, or drowning it in legal procedures and political contacts. He had known from the first entry in the hidden ledger that a moment like this one was the terminal possibility. He just hadn't believed it would actually arrive. That was his real mistake, not underestimating Clara's memory, not failing to destroy the ledger in time, believing that the moment could always be postponed. Booth recessed the session at 4:30 with instructions that the parties would reconvene the following morning for his findings, and that Nathaniel Crow was not to leave Cheyenne and was not to contact any employee, former or current of the ranch operation, or any official of the Territorial Land Office, pending the completion of proceedings. Crow's lawyers objected. Booth looked at them with the expression of a man who has heard a great many objections over a long career and reserves his responses for the ones that have legal merit. He said nothing. He left the room. Outside the courthouse in the late afternoon, Clara stood on the steps with Ruth and Agnes, and Martha and Cole came down the steps behind them and stopped beside Clara, and the four of them looked out at Cheyenne, going about its evening without any awareness of what had just happened inside the federal building behind them. Martha spoke first. "Tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow," Ruth agreed. "Booth will issue findings. Given what's in front of him, the labor fraud charges are certain. The land office expansion will require additional investigation, but he'll open a federal inquiry, I'm certain of that." She paused. "Crow is not going home." Agnes said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "I want to know what happens to his operation, the ranch, the workers still there." "The evidence preservation order covers all business operations," Ruth said. "No one can be dismissed from employment or have their debt status altered pending the outcome of proceedings. Every worker currently on that property has legal protection as of 2 days ago." She looked at Agnes. "They will be notified. All of them." Agnes closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, Clara saw what 9 years of waiting looked like when it finally finds its reason. She didn't say anything. Neither did anyone else. Some things didn't need words. Cole touched Clara's arm lightly, barely a touch, the briefest contact enough to tell her he was there without making it larger than she needed it to be right now. She looked at him sideways. "One more day," she said. "One more day," he said. She turned and looked back out at Cheyenne and thought about 61 names on 12 pages and 72 names when you added Agnes's list, and however many more the federal investigation would surface from records she hadn't reached and records she hadn't known existed. She thought about a woman named Josephine Maddox, 23 years old, with a plan she'd been saving for since she was 16. She thought about every woman who had walked onto Crow Ranch believing the debt was real and discoverable, that there was a way out of it if they worked hard enough and kept the accounts straight. She thought about what it meant that tomorrow, in a federal courthouse in Cheyenne, the architecture of what had been done to all of them was going to be entered into the official record of the United States of America, where it could not be hidden behind a false panel or pressured into silence or dismissed by men who preferred not to look. The sun was going down over Cheyenne. Inside the courthouse behind them, in a federal marshal's lockbox, the hidden ledger sat in the light for the first time in 11 years. And Nathaniel Crow, for the first time in 11 years, had no way to put it back in the dark. Booth's findings came at 9 o'clock the following morning, exactly when he said they would. Clara had not slept much. She had lain on the narrow boarding house cot and listened to the quiet of Cheyenne at night and run through everything one more time. Not because she was uncertain, but because she had spent 5 years being precise about things that mattered. And she was not going to stop being precise about the most important thing she had ever been precise about. She was dressed and ready before 6. Ruth found her at the small table in the common room at 6:30 with a cup of coffee and the 12 pages spread in front of her, and Ruth sat down across from her and poured her own coffee and said nothing, which was exactly right, because there was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said or documented or entered into federal record. They sat together in the quiet for 20 minutes. Two women who had each spent years being careful in a world that required careful women to be invisible. And on this particular morning, they were neither careful nor invisible, and the quality of the silence between them held that fact without needing to name it. Agnes came down at 7, Martha at 7:30. Cole appeared at 8, having been somewhere else for reasons he didn't explain, and that Clara understood she didn't need to know yet. They walked to the courthouse together. Crow was already seated when they entered with his two lawyers, and Gerald Pruitt and Benjamin Crow was seated on the opposite side of the room from his father, which told Clara everything she needed to know about what the night had been like in the Crow camp. Booth entered at precisely 9. He sat. He arranged his papers. He looked at the room with the focused, unhurried attention of a man who had made his decision and was going to deliver it with the weight it deserved. In the matter of the emergency federal deposition proceeding initiated by counsel Ruth Calloway on behalf of Clara Whitmore, Agnes Hooper, and Martha Bell, he began. And his voice carried the particular authority of someone who has said important things in important rooms for a long time and knows the difference between a decision and a verdict. This court finds as follows. The room was absolutely silent. The testimony of Clara Whitmore is found to be credible, internally consistent, and corroborated by physical documentation at multiple points. The hidden ledger retrieved from the concealed compartment in the respondent's private office is found to be authentic and to constitute primary evidence of a systematic fraudulent fee scheme operating outside the respondent's official financial records. Clara heard Agnes exhale beside her. The physical documentation presented by Agnes Hooper, including signed receipts and original correspondence, is found to corroborate the existence and operation of said fraudulent scheme across a period of at least 9 years. The original correspondence presented by Martha Bell is found to establish the respondent's direct personal authorization of fee structures that appear in no legitimate business record. Booth paused and looked at his papers. The testimony of Benjamin Crow, given voluntarily and under oath, establishes that the respondent was aware of the secondary accounting system no later than 4 years prior to these proceedings, and took no action to remedy, disclose, or terminate the fraudulent scheme. This constitutes knowing continuation of fraud. Crow's lead lawyer, Alderton, began to rise. "I will note for the record," Booth said without looking up, "that I have not finished, and that counsel for the respondent will have full opportunity to address these findings through the appropriate federal appellate process. Sit down." Alderton sat down. "Based on the foregoing," Booth continued, "this court finds sufficient basis to refer this matter to federal prosecution on charges including, but not limited to, systematic labor contract fraud, financial conspiracy, and the unlawful deprivation of liberty through contractual coercion." He looked up from his papers for the first time since he began. "The fraudulent debt obligations of all workers documented in the hidden ledger, including all persons named in Miss Whitmore's sworn testimony, are hereby declared void as instruments of fraud, effective immediately." Clara heard Martha make a sound, a very small sound, quickly controlled. "In addition," Booth said, and his voice shifted slightly. Just slightly, but enough that Clara registered the shift and paid closer attention. "This court is expanding the scope of federal inquiry to include land office transactions conducted in conjunction with the respondent's operation over the preceding 11 years. A federal warrant has been issued this morning for the financial records of the Cheyenne Territorial Land Office. The specific official whose correspondence was found in the respondent's private files is hereby placed under federal administrative suspension pending investigation." Crow said nothing. He had not moved since Booth began speaking. Clara looked at him. He was looking at the front of the room with the specific quality of stillness that belongs to men who have built something large and certain over a long period of time and are sitting in the moment when they understand it is gone. Not crumbling, not threatened. Gone. The way a structure doesn't slowly lean, but simply is standing and then is not. "Nathaniel Crow," Booth said, "you are remanded to federal custody pending formal indictment. Marshal Reeves." Reeves stood. Gerald Pruitt stood up suddenly. "Your Honor, this is—" "Mr. Pruitt," Booth said, looking at him directly for the first time. "You are not a party to these proceedings and have no standing to address this court. I would advise you strongly to seek your own legal counsel before the week is out." Pruitt sat down. Reeves crossed the room toward Crow. Crow stood without being asked. He straightened his jacket, that precise, habitual gesture that Clara had watched him perform 100 times, the adjustment of appearance as a performance of control. And he looked across the room directly at Clara. It was a long look, not angry, not contemptuous. Something she couldn't fully name, which surprised her because she had believed she knew every expression in his range. Then he looked away and walked with Reeves toward the door and did not look back. Benjamin Crow watched his father leave. His face was composed in the way of someone who has already done the hardest part of a hard thing and is now in the aftermath, which is not easier but is different, the particular quiet that follows an act of irreversible honesty. Clara crossed the room to where he was sitting. He looked up at her. "You did the right thing," she said. "I should have done it 4 years ago," he said. "Yes," she said without softening it. "But you did it today, and today is what we have." She paused. "There are women whose debts were canceled this morning because you walked into this building. Remember that." He nodded once. He didn't have words, and she didn't require them. She went back to Ruth and Agnes and Martha and Cole. Ruth was already organizing her papers with the focused efficiency of a woman who has just accomplished something significant and is already thinking about what comes next. Agnes was crying quietly. Not in distress, in the specific release of someone who has been carrying something for 9 years and has finally set it down and is feeling the sudden lightness of hands that have been full for so long they'd forgotten what empty felt like. Martha had her arm around Agnes's shoulders and was saying nothing because Martha Bell had always understood that some moments don't need words. Cole was standing slightly apart watching Clara, and when she reached him he said nothing either. She looked up at him. "Josephine," she said. "Ruth filed a request this morning," he said, "for access to federal labor records across 3 territories going back 12 years. If she was processed through a scheme like Crow's, if her name appears anywhere in documents connected to this network." He stopped. "It will be found," Clara said. "It may take time," he said carefully, and she understood he was managing his own hope the way she had managed her fear carefully, specifically not letting it run ahead of what was known. "It will take whatever time it takes," she said, "and we will follow it wherever it goes." He looked at her for a moment. "We," he said. "We," she confirmed. Something settled in his face, not the absence of the weight he'd been carrying, but the presence of something alongside it, something that made the weight different to carry. He nodded once. "All right," he said. 3 months later, Clara Whitmore opened a small office in Silver Creek. It had taken 3 months to find the right space to arrange the funding, which came partly from a territory-wide legal settlement that Nathaniel Crow's lawyers negotiated on his behalf to reduce his federal sentencing exposure, and partly from a public collection organized by Ruth Calloway that drew contributions from towns and individuals across Wyoming Territory, whose names Clara would spend a long time being grateful for, and to establish the specific structure of what she intended to do there. The sign above the door was simple. Ruth had offered to help her write something more elaborate, something that communicated the full scope of the services available, and Clara had thanked her and written the sign herself. It read, "No person belongs to another." Underneath in smaller letters, "Legal assistance, shelter referral, and debt review for women in contract disputes. All services free of charge." Agnes Hooper ran the shelter referral program. She had moved to Silver Creek 6 weeks after the Cheyenne proceedings, giving up the modest and difficult life she'd been building in Porter's Crossing for 9 years, and she had arrived at Clara's door with her tin box under her arm and asked what needed doing. Clara had told her. Agnes had started the next morning. Martha Bell came twice a month from Arlen on the same horse she'd been riding since before Clara knew her name, and she brought things: food supplies, information about women in surrounding areas who might need to know about the office, with the steady practical generosity of a person who has been helping others quietly for so long that it has simply become the shape of how she moves through the world. Ruth Calloway handled the legal filings. There were many. The federal inquiry into Crow's land fraud operation expanded in the months following the Cheyenne proceedings to include records from 4 additional territories, and as the scope of the investigation grew, so did the number of names that emerged from documents that had been hidden or ignored or dismissed for years. Workers who had vanished, debts that had been engineered to trap, properties that had changed hands under fraudulent pretense. Each name that came out of the federal record was a name that was owed something. Clara kept track of every one. Nathaniel Crow's conviction came 6 months after the deposition. He was sentenced to 12 years in a federal penitentiary on consolidated fraud and conspiracy charges. His land holdings were seized, pending the resolution of the land fraud investigation. His empire, which had stood on the labor of people he had deliberately trapped and systematically erased, was dismantled methodically and completely by the same federal system he had believed his money and influence could indefinitely control. Gerald Pruitt was indicted on charges of conspiracy and fraud 3 weeks after Crow's arrest. He cooperated with federal prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence, and his cooperation produced 14 additional names of individuals who had been processed through the fraudulent debt scheme and whose whereabouts had been unknown. 14 names that had been lost. 14 people who could now be looked for. The land office official whose correspondence had sat in Crow's private files was removed from his position and referred for federal prosecution on charges of official corruption. His removal triggered an administrative review of land transactions across the territory that was still ongoing a year after the Cheyenne proceedings. Benjamin Crow used what remained of his personal assets, a modest inheritance from his mother's estate that had been kept separate from his father's operation, to establish a fund for workers whose fraudulent debts required legal adjudication. He worked with Ruth Calloway's office on the case filings. He was not redeemed by this. He did not expect to be. He did it because it was the correct thing to do, and because somewhere in the past few months he had arrived at the understanding that correctness done consistently and without expectation of recognition was the only honest way forward. Clara saw him occasionally when he came to Ruth's office for case consultations. They did not have an easy relationship. She was not certain they ever would have one. But they had a working one, and in the world, Clara Whitmore operated in a working relationship oriented toward the right outcome was worth more than an easy one that wasn't. Cole stayed. He had not announced this. He had not made a declaration or asked permission or framed it in any way that required her to respond to it as a significant decision. He had simply continued to be present, available, useful, reliable in the specific way of someone who shows up consistently, because he has decided to show up, and not because he needs acknowledgement for the showing up. He helped with things the office needed that were outside the legal and administrative domain. Physical repairs to the building, logistical problems that required someone who knew the territory and could navigate it without drawing the wrong kind of attention. The occasional situation where a woman arriving at the office door was followed by someone who needed to be made to understand in plain terms that he should leave. He was very good at the plain terms conversation. He and Clara had developed a working language that operated efficiently without requiring much explaining, built from 3 days of riding hard across Wyoming territory, under pressure, and everything that had happened since. They understood each other's thinking at a pace that made collaboration easy and disagreement rare. And when they did disagree, which they did, because they were both people with strong views and the habit of saying those views directly, they said it plainly and resolved it and moved on without residue. One evening, 4 months after the office opened, they were the last 2 people there working through a set of files Ruth had sent from the latest federal discovery release. New names, new documentation, each one representing a person who deserved an accounting. Cole looked up from the file he was reading. "There's a name here," he said. His voice was very controlled. Clara looked up. "What name?" she said. He turned the page toward her. She read it. Josephine Maddox. Age at time of documentation 23. Territory Colorado. Fraudulent labor contract affiliate operation of the Crow Network. Date of last recorded contact 8 years ago. Current whereabouts unknown. Clara looked at the page for a long moment. Then she looked at Cole. His expression was the most open she had ever seen it all. The careful management of hope and expectation and grief that he had been carrying for 8 years visible at once, not because he had lost control of it, but because he had decided to stop controlling it for a moment in front of her, which was its own kind of statement about what she was to him. She was in the network, she said. She was in the network, he said. That means there are records, Clara said. The Colorado affiliate operation is part of the federal inquiry. If there are records... There are records, he said. Then we find her, Clara said. He looked at her. She looked back at him. We find her, she said again, and there was nothing uncertain in it, nothing hedged or qualified or softened. It was a statement of fact about the future delivered with the same precision she brought to every figure that mattered. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. Not a dramatic gesture, not a performance. Simply, a person touching another person across a table covered in documents that represented the recovered names of people who had been made to disappear, saying with a hand what neither of them had yet said in words, and both of them had understood for weeks. She turned her hand and held his. They sat like that for a moment in the quiet of the office with the sign above the door reading its 7 words to the empty Silver Creek Street outside, and the files spread between them, and somewhere in those files, the thread of a trail that was 8 years old and had just become the next thing Clara Whitmore was going to find. A year after the Cheyenne proceedings, people across Wyoming Territory and beyond would remember 2 things about what had happened at Crow Ranch on that burning September morning. They would remember the 60 men who stood around a corral and watched, and what that silence had cost, and the long, uncomfortable reckoning that came with being a witness who had chosen the wrong side of history before history made itself clear. And they would remember the outlaw who rode in slow and quiet and put his hand on the fence rail and said 4 words that iron goes back and meant every syllable of them with the full weight of a man who had already paid the price of looking away once and had decided he would not pay it again. But the women who walked through the door of the Silver Creek office in the months and years that followed, women who arrived frightened and alone and carrying debts they hadn't earned, and stories they'd been told no one would believe, those women would remember something else entirely. They would remember the woman who opened the door, the woman who looked at them and said without preamble and without performance, "You are not a debt. You are not a possession. Whatever they told you you were, that is not what you are." The woman who had knelt in the dirt before 60 men with her hands bound and refused to close her eyes. The woman who had walked out of that corral and spent every hour since making certain that what had been done to her and to 72 women before her, and to everyone whose names emerged from the federal records afterward, was not done again. Clara Whitmore had not set out to change the territory. She had set out to survive a mourning. But the women who came to her door understood something that Nathaniel Crow, with all his ledgers and all his contracts and all his 60 witnesses, had never understood and would spend 12 years in a federal penitentiary failing to understand. The most dangerous person in any unjust system is not the one with the power. It is the one who was supposed to be silenced and who refused.